It was the spring of 1984, and the first thing Clara Henson saw every morning was a mountain. Not a mountain of stone and earth, but one of raw yellow sawdust, growing larger with each passing day. The trucks from the lumber mill came without ceremony, their engines groaning as they backed up to the edge of her family's north pasture, a field that had once been green with clover. With a hydraulic hiss and a roar, they would tip their beds, and a fresh avalanche of wood pulp, shavings, and dust would cascade down the slope, burying another 10 feet of Henson land. The air, for a mile in every direction, smelled perpetually of pine resin and defeat. The neighbors, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity, would sometimes slow their pickups on the county road to watch. They saw a 25-year-old woman and her aging father being slowly, methodically erased from the landscape. They saw a tragedy, an injustice, a fight already lost. They were wrong. What they failed to see was that Clara Henson was not just watching the destruction of her farm. She was studying it. Let me tell you about the land itself. The Henson farm was not prime real estate. It was 160 acres of rolling, stubborn clay, purchased by Clara's grandfather with the last of his savings after the Great War. It was the kind of land that broke plows and hearts with equal indifference. Other farmers in the valley had rich, black loam that crumbled in your hands like cake. The Hensons had soil that baked to concrete in the summer and turned to a thick, unforgiving gumbo in the winter. For 2 generations they had fought it, amended it, and coaxed a living from it. But it was a constant, wearying battle. The lumber mill, a new and powerful force in the county, had seen the farm for what the bank ledger said it was: marginal. They had found a legal loophole, an easement from the 1890s for timber transport, and they had twisted its meaning with expensive lawyers until it gave them the right to dump their industrial waste. They saw a convenient, worthless hollow to fill. Her father, Elias Henson, was a good man worn down by time and trouble. He was a man of paper and ink. Each week he would sit at the small kitchen table, his hand shaking slightly, and compose another letter. He wrote to the mill's corporate office, to the county commissioner, to the Environmental Protection Agency, to his state representative. He sent registered mail filled with photographs, soil samples, and carefully worded pleas for intervention. Most letters went unanswered. The few replies he did receive were sterile, form letter dismissals, citing the legality of the easement and disavowing any responsibility. Each unopened return envelope was a small death, chipping away at his resolve. He believed the fight would be won with the right words, on the right piece of paper, in front of the right official. He was a man of systems and rules, and he could not comprehend that the system was now the weapon being used against him. Clara watched him, her heart aching, but her focus was elsewhere. It was not in the mailbox. It was in the dirt. You see, her father had given her a different kind of education, one that did not involve lawyers or bureaucrats. Elias was a quiet philosopher of the soil. When Clara was a girl, he had not taught her to drive a tractor by showing her the ignition. He had taught her to walk the fields after a rain, to listen to the sound her boots made. "Hear that squelch?" he would say, his voice a low rumble. "That's the sound of suffocating roots. The water has nowhere to go. This land isn't mean, Clara. It's just thirsty and breathless, all at the same time." He taught her that the color of a cornstalk's leaf was a sentence, and that her job was to learn how to read it. He kept journals, dozens of them, filled not with finances but with observations. June 4th, 1968, one entry read, "East pasture clover showing pale. Too much rain has leached the nitrogen. The worms are sluggish." His greatest lesson was about decay. He never saw a fallen tree or a pile of rotting leaves as waste. He saw it as a promise. Everything that dies is just dinner for what's waiting to be born, he taught her, turning over a scoop of dark leaf mold with a pitchfork. The forest doesn't need us to fertilize it. It makes its own. It's a slow conversation between the dead and the living. Our job is to learn the language. He had left his journals in a wooden chest in the barn. They were her inheritance, more valuable than any deed or title. They were a library of a forgotten language. And as the Sawdust Mountain grew, Clara began to see it not as a monument to their defeat, but as a massive, jumbled, unread dictionary. Now, let me explain what Clara saw. The sawdust pile was not uniform. The mill had been dumping for months, and the oldest deposits, at the very bottom of the ever-growing slope, had been there through a fall and a winter. They were darker, soaked with rain and snowmelt, and beginning to break down. Where the raw yellow dust was piled high, nothing grew. It was a sterile desert. But along the darkened, weathered edges, where the layer was thinner and had been sitting longer, she noticed something impossible. A few stubborn weeds and blades of grass were not just surviving. They were thriving. They were a deeper, more vibrant green than the grass in their untouched pastures. They were stronger, thicker, and taller. The neighbors saw weeds on a pile of trash. The mill executives, if they ever bothered to look, would have seen nothing at all. But Clara, armed with her father's wisdom, saw the principle of the forest floor playing out on an industrial scale. She saw a slow conversation beginning. The sawdust by itself was useless. It was all carbon, a massive store of locked-up energy. But it was starving the soil beneath it, because in order to decay, the microorganisms that break down carbon need nitrogen. With no nitrogen available, they pulled it from the topsoil, effectively poisoning the ground for any new growth. This is what the experts knew. This is why everyone thought the land was permanently ruined. Section, but they had missed the second act. Clara knelt at the edge of the pile, pushing her hands into the damp, older material. It was still gritty, but it was cooler and it had the faint, earthy smell of a forest path. She understood. The rain had provided the moisture. Time was providing the fungi. The only thing missing was a significant source of nitrogen to balance the equation and accelerate the process. The sawdust wasn't a poison. It was a battery, a massive, inert battery, and it needed a jump start. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea no one else believed in? Clara Henson was about to do just that. She did not try to write another letter. She did not try to argue with the truck drivers. She went to the barn, pulled the heavy doors open, and found the old manure spreader rusting in a corner. It hadn't been used in years. Her father had switched to chemical fertilizers in the 70s, a decision he always regretted, calling it a lazy man's fix. Clara found his journals open to a page from 1965 and read his meticulous notes on compost ratios, carbon to nitrogen, browns to greens. He had been perfecting this long before she was born. Her decisive act was one of quiet, back-breaking labor. She made a deal with a chicken farmer 3 miles down the road. He had his own mountain, a mountain of nitrogen-rich chicken manure that he had to pay to have hauled away. He laughed when she offered to take it for free. "You want my troubles, little lady? They're all yours," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. For the next 2 years, from the time she was 25 to the day she turned 27, Clara's life was a rhythm of toil. Twice a week, she would drive the old farm truck and trailer to the chicken farm and shovel the pungent manure until her muscles screamed. She would bring it back and begin the alchemy. The work was a blur of motion and exhaustion. Using the old tractor with its front-end loader, She started building new mountains next to the sawdust pile. She would lay down a thick layer of sawdust, a foot deep, then a thinner layer of the chicken manure. She'd water it down, then add another layer of sawdust and another of manure. She built windrows, long, massive piles 20 feet wide and 8 feet high. The whispers in the community grew louder. They had moved past pity and into ridicule. "Old Elias's girl has finally snapped," they'd say over coffee at the town diner. "Trying to farm sawdust and chicken droppings. A tragic shame." They saw a fool's errand, a young woman burying herself in filth, chasing a fantasy. There were moments of private doubt, deep, soul-crushing doubt. One sweltering August, a windrow she had spent a month building refused to heat up. The internal temperature, which needed to reach 140 degrees to kill weed seeds and properly decompose, hovered at a lukewarm 90. It was a failure. She had gotten the ratio wrong, or perhaps the moisture was off. For a full day, she sat on the porch, staring at the inert pile. The smell of failure thick in the air. The temptation to give up, to sell the ruined land for pennies on the dollar and walk away, was a physical weight in her chest. That night, she went to the barn, lit a lantern, and opened her father's journals again. His spidery handwriting seemed to reach out to her from the page. "The land is patient," he had written in 1972. "It does not operate on our schedule. Watch, listen, and adjust. Do not command." She had been commanding. The next morning, she was back on the tractor, breaking the pile apart and remixing it, adding more nitrogen, more water. She was listening. 2 weeks later, steam began to rise from the peak of the windrow in the cool morning air. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was the quiet satisfaction of a small, early success. For 2 years, this was her life. The lumber mill trucks kept coming, but they had to drive around her new dark mountains to get to the raw yellow one. The drivers would sometimes stop and stare, bewildered by the sight of this lone woman orchestrating a strange and filthy ballet with a tractor. Her father, seeing the fire in her, had stopped writing his letters. He began to help where he could, mostly by bringing her water and mending her torn gloves. He didn't fully understand the science, but he understood the philosophy. He saw his own teachings being manifested on a scale he had never dared to imagine. Then, in the spring of her 27th year, it was ready. The material in the first windrow she had built was no longer sawdust and manure. It was a black, rich, homogeneous substance that smelled of fresh earth and rain. It was humus, the lifeblood of soil. It crumbled in her hands, holding moisture but not clumping. It was perfect. She had created in 2 years what it took the forest floor a decade to make. The undeniable harvest was next. She chose their worst field, a 5-acre plot of hard red clay near the road. A field that had consistently produced stunted, pathetic-looking crops. It was the field the neighbors saw every day. She did not till it, following a final principle from her father's notes. That tillage destroys soil structure and fungal networks. She used the old manure spreader to lay down a 2-inch blanket of her black compost over the entire plot. Then she planted corn, using a no-till planter to slice through the compost and into the clay below. The skeptical collective watched. They saw her spreading black dirt on top of red clay and shook their heads. "Won't work," one of them told his son. "That corn will sprout and die. The roots will hit that hardpan and give up." They were wrong. The corn did not give up. It exploded. By July, it was a local spectacle. The corn in Clara's test plot was a full 2 feet taller than any other corn in the valley. Its leaves were a deep, glossy green, and the stalks were thick as a man's wrist. When the county extension agent, a man named Henderson who had always been kind but dismissive, came to see it. He was speechless. He walked into the rows, vanishing into the green jungle. He pulled an ear from a stalk, peeled back the husk, and stared at the perfectly formed, milky kernels. "Clara," he said, his voice full of awe, "I've been doing this job for 30 years. I've never seen corn like this grown in this county. Not on the best bottomland, let alone on this clay." He took soil samples not just of her compost, but of the clay beneath it. The reports that came back were revolutionary. The microbial life in the soil had skyrocketed. The earthworm population had increased tenfold. The compost was not just feeding the plants, it was healing the land itself, creating a living, breathing ecosystem that was making the old, stubborn clay pliable and fertile. When the harvest came, the numbers told the story in a language everyone understood. The county average for corn that year was 110 bushels per acre. The best farms, the ones with the rich, black soil, hit 140 on a good year. Clara Henson's 5-acre plot, on the worst land in the valley, produced 220 bushels per acre. She hadn't just beaten the record, she had shattered it. Vindication did not come in the form of a newspaper article, though there were a few. It came in the form of a dust-covered sedan pulling into her driveway. A man in a suit, looking uncomfortable and out of place, stepped out. It was Mr. Davies, the regional manager for the lumber mill, the man who had never answered her father's letters. He was the gatekeeper, the embodiment of the corporate arrogance that had tried to bury them. He didn't offer pleasantries. He stood for a long time, looking from the towering, healthy corn stalks to the remaining mountain of raw sawdust, and then to the long, dark windrows of finished compost. The contrast was a silent, powerful accusation. Finally, he turned to Clara, who stood on her porch, wiping her hands on a rag. She did not offer him a seat. "How?" Davies asked. It was not a demand. It was a plea. "We've spent millions on consultants and engineers trying to figure out what to do with this waste. They told us it would poison the land for a century. How did you do this?" Clara looked at the man, at his expensive suit and his bewildered face. There was no triumph in her expression, only a quiet, settled truth. "You saw waste," she said, her voice even. "My father taught me to see a pantry. The land was just hungry. I fed it." Davies looked down at his polished shoes, a faint dusting of Henson soil on them. For the first time, he seemed to see the farm not as a line item on a map, but as a place. "We were wrong," he said, the words costing him dearly. "We were completely wrong. My company, I apologize to you and your father." He extended a hand. Clara looked at it for a moment before taking it. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement. The fight was over, but a new chapter was beginning. "We will pay to have the rest of this removed," Davies said quickly. "And we will pay for the damage to your land." "No," Clara said simply. Davies blinked. "No? Don't touch it," she said, nodding toward the Sawdust Mountain. "That's my supply. But you can have this." She kicked at a small pile of the finished black compost near the porch steps. "This is the solution to your problem. You have a waste product. I have a process. I'll sell you the solution." The long view is where the real story lives. The subsequent 2 decades were a masterclass in patience and integrity. Clara Henson did not become a partner with the lumber mill. She founded the Henson Soil Company, a small, fiercely independent operation based in her father's old barn. She took out one small loan from the now eager-to-please bank to purchase a commercial compost turner and a bagging machine. The mill became her first and largest customer. They paid her to take their sawdust, and then she sold the finished compost. back to them at a premium to remediate the other lands they had damaged across the state. The irony was as rich as her soil. She never expanded beyond what she and a small, well-paid crew could handle. Her father, who lived to see the first 10 years of her success, spent his final days not writing letters, but sitting on the porch, watching the trucks come and go. Not to dump, but to buy. He watched his daughter save the farm not by fighting the system, but by creating a better one. During the farm crisis of the late 90s, when debt and the rising cost of chemical fertilizers crushed many of her neighbors, Clara, who was entirely debt-free, began to buy land. She bought the farm of the man who had laughed at her for taking his chicken manure. She bought the farm of the man who had told his son her corn would die. She paid fair prices in cash. She didn't gloat. She simply took their tired, chemically addicted land and began the slow process of healing it with her black gold. She was not building an empire. She was rebuilding a valley. Years later, a young reporter came to do a story on the legendary Sawdust savant of the valley. She found a woman in her late 40s, her face lined by sun and laughter, her hands still stained with the good earth. She was no longer an underestimated outsider. She was the vindicated master, the respected elder. The reporter saw the sprawling, healthy fields, the clean barns, the quiet prosperity. She saw a young apprentice, a teenager from town, listening intently as Clara explained the importance of the carbon-to-nitrogen ratio. The reporter asked the same question Davies had asked all those years ago. "How did you know?" Clara smiled, a slow, patient smile. She walked to the old wooden chest her father had left her and pulled out one of his journals. She handed it to the reporter. The page was open to a simple, declarative sentence, written in 1968. "The soil is not a machine," it read. "It is a stomach. It digests death into life." The final moral is this: the company men in their suits, the experts with their charts, the neighbors with their certainty, they all saw a problem to be disposed of. They saw a linear path from a tree to a mill, to a product, to waste. They believed in endings. Clara Henson, taught by her father and by the land itself, saw a circle. She knew that waste is just a failure of imagination. The company tried to bury her land in their refuse, convinced of its worthlessness. But she kept the farm and the land, patient and wise, remembered how to turn their trash into her treasure. It always does.